Thank you very much, Natalia, for that very elaborate introduction. You didn't need to do all of that, but I'm really pleased to share this platform with our colleagues from the Mexican Permanent Mission. Mexico has been a driving force behind the CTBT, and I will never, kind of lose sight, and I always make this point that, Mexico brought the issue to the fore at the 1990 NPT Review Conference, causing that conference not to be able to adopt a final document based on the issue principle that the CTBT should be included as an objective. And of course, we know that President Clinton in 1993 pushed the CTBT negotiations in the General Assembly. So there's a direct linkage between what happened in 1990 and, of course, the United States' desire to have us indefinite extension of the NPT, in which the CTBT was a key element to get there. So it's very appropriate to have Mexico as a speaker here today. I have a very elaborate presentation. I cut it down and I will go through some slides, but I'm always keen also to hear from our colleagues in Vienna. So very, very briefly, if you look over time, the arms race and nuclear testing go hand in hand. So we know that the first test was conducted in 1945 in the Almagora Desert here in the United States, relatively small compared to test the nuclear weapons of today. Hiroshima and Nagasaki shortly followed. In a very perverse way, I would argue that those two, the use of nuclear weapons were in fact also tests, because then I will point out shortly what are the motivations for testing, and the use of nuclear weapons in Japan actually ticked off at least two of those motivations. And then you see, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, but over time, the other states that are today considered states with nuclear weapons all tested. But you also see the increase in size and yield of these weapons while they become smaller in physical size. And so, and that of course spurred the arms race. So just a quick example here, the largest nuclear weapon ever tested or device was the Tsar bomb, which was tested at 57 megatons. I want to emphasize megatons. The smallest one was the little fellow at Davy Crockett by the United States of 0.02 kilotons. Just to give you a size comparison, the plume of this Tsar bomb went 64 kilometers into the sky. Well, this little thing was fired by a bazooka, and it had about a 2-mile distance that it could travel. So you could kind of consider that the poor soldier firing it was on a self-destruct mission. So when I was at the CTBTO, we used to call this the fever chart, and it measured the international security fever. And I can give you a whole talk what lies behind this, but the chart obviously shows the number of nuclear tests conducted over time, starting in 1945, and with the last test of North Korea in 2017. But it shows far more than that. It shows a gap here, and that gap was as a result of efforts by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union in the late 50s to actually try to negotiate a comprehensive test ban. But what we see, what happened after that gap, of course, is a spike in nuclear testing, and that happened in 1962. And of course, we all know what happened in 1962, the Caribbean Missile Crisis or Cuban Missile Crisis, and we see a massive spike. So big lessons from this map is, one, of course, you can see how many tests were conducted, but that moratoria are only as good as the pen that wrote the pen and paper that it was used to write on. It can easily be scrapped. But the other important part of this map is to see at 1996, That was when the CTBT was signed. And so I am to be convinced by anyone to say that we live in a more volatile time from 96 to now, when it's fairly flat. Only 3 countries have tested nuclear weapons in that period than the previous years, when you have hundreds and hundreds of tests, and the environment was very poisonous. Here's another way to look at it. 2,047 tests have occurred from 1945 to 1996. That means 1 test every 9 days for 50 years. So just think about it. I think if I look at Ambassador Campuzano, I see some gray hair. Mine is very thinning, but there are some of us that may remember those times. But today, this is not really a concern anymore. And so we cannot forget what the legacy of these nuclear tests meant. So this is why it's important not only to look at what the CTBT does, but also to consider the impact of nuclear testing. So I'm going to take a little time to focus on that in my talk. I'm not going to play this video. I do encourage you to look at it. It is a very dramatic, artistic view of nuclear testing made by a Japanese artist, Isawa Hashimoto. It is on the, I've asked Manuel to put it on the reading list, but you'll hear sounds and you see flashes of nuclear tests, about 10 minutes long. And you'll also find a part there where it becomes quiet and then it starts all over again. I encourage you to watch it when you have time. Again, and just a little size comparison, Hiroshima, which was a 13 kiloton weapon, compared to the largest device ever tested, the Tsar bomb. So where did nuclear tests occur? This is kind of an interesting map to look at, and you can understand it links to a number of other things, including obviously what we discussed a few days ago, the establishment of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, because France tested in Algeria. That inspired a Brazilian diplomat who served in Africa, and we know how the leading role that especially Mexico played in making sure that Latin America became a nuclear weapon free area, and subsequent zones were established, almost all of them as a direct result of a response to nuclear testing. So we will see that in the South Pacific area, for instance, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France conducted tests, and that led to the establishment of the Treaty of Rarotonga. In the Central Asian part here, where Kazakhstan is, we know that the Soviet Union did most of their tests in Kazakhstan, and that eventually also led to the Treaty of Central Asia. The United States tested all over the world. In fact, of the nuclear weapon states, you can argue the United States actually poisoned most of the world with its nuclear tests. Countries such as India, Pakistan, and North Korea tested only on their own territories. France also tested in the Pacific and in Northern Africa or Algeria. So notably, the United Kingdom and France didn't test on their own territories, which is, you can argue how that went through history. But I think it's very important to kind of look at this map and start thinking, if you're going to try and prevent or deter testing, what do you need to do to do that? You need to have a system that is, one, not discriminatory, but two, designed to deter these countries that have already tested from doing so, but also to make sure that others will not do so. And therefore, you need to look at what are the different testing environments. So originally, the first test was done above ground. The Trinity test was actually put on a tower of about 20 meters into above ground and detonated. Then tests went underground. Tests were conducted in the atmosphere. Tests were conducted underwater. And so if you're going to try and detect these tests, you need highly specialized equipment. And that's why for many, many years, there were attempts made by scientists to say, what kind of technologies do we need to detect tests? And while there was political opposition to a CTBT in the 60s and 70s, scientific experimentation and technological advancement combined started to pave the way that eventually would become the international monitoring system that is the backbone of the CTBT. So from early weapons, I'm not going to go into the detail, but these are the basic weapons, of course, from Hiroshima and that was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to very advanced and sophisticated weapons, including, modern thermonuclear weapons. For all of them, nuclear testing was required to develop. And I put a big caveat here, of course, that modern nuclear weapons are no longer tested with physical testing, and I'll come back to that. The point here is that if you have a test ban, just like we discussed the issue of fissile material, then you prevent states, or you make it far more difficult for states to design modern nuclear weapons. But I have to add that for a weapon such as a gun type that was used in Hiroshima, and the weapons that South Africa developed, no testing is required. I would obviously add that I think, given that the very first gun type device ever used was on Hiroshima, it served as a test. It also served as a test to the Soviet Union as a political message. Moving on to why states test. I can go into great detail. I have a lot of slides on this, and I'm not going to do that. But there are basically five principal reasons. The first one is weapons test. This just to make sure that the actual thing, it goes off. I mean, if you're going to use the ultimate weapon, sending it to your adversary, in most cases, the adversary is going to respond, right? So you want to make sure that your weapon goes off at that yield. You don't want a weapon that is designed to be a 20 kiloton or a 150 kiloton device that is designed to destroy your adversary's nuclear bunkers, and it doesn't work. That's what the weapons affect, how much blast area you can create. Safety tests. So there's a variety of them. One, these weapons fly through very harsh environments, through the atmosphere, and also in case of accidental, say, aircraft crashes, and you'll be surprised how many of these accidents have happened over time, that the weapons don't go off by accident. At the same time, there must be a devices in there so that the weapons can't be accidentally armed. And so these are all mechanisms that are tested through actual testing. Then weapons development, obviously the performance, weaponization testing, and physics. These are all parts of the reasons why it's tested. Very importantly, there are political motivations. That fever chart that I showed you showed how, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, communicated with each other. During the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were nuclear tests going off by the United States. And that was clearly a political signal to the Soviet Union. Security, also in terms of domestic politics, and a number of countries. India is a very good example, so is Pakistan. Clearly the issue of acquiring a nuclear weapon, showcasing that India is capable of doing so by nuclear testing, bolstered the government of that time. And you may remember when both those countries tested, I mean, people were celebrating in the streets. And then finally, peaceful nuclear explosions. This is a strange phenomena, and I'll spend a little bit of time because there's actually a linkage between what we call P&Es and the Treaty of Tlatelolco. This is the largest human-made crater in the world. It is the Sedan crater. which is in the Nevada, located on what is formerly known as the Nevada test site of the United States. It is about 630 feet deep, and the device used was a peaceful nuclear explosion, was about 104 kilotons. It sent a lot of dust into the atmosphere, causing, adding to the nuclear fallout in the United States. This picture was taken by a visit of the CTBTO inspection trainees in 2016, and we're looking over the site. It is actually publicly accessible through appointment. Quite a spectacular thing to see, I must say. But here's just an example of how international law is kind of contradictory. You'll find Article 5 of the NPT, which we've already discussed, actually saying that while countries with nuclear weapons can test for peaceful uses, they must share that benefits with non-nuclear weapon states. Tlatelolco even goes further. I remember Tlatelolco predates the NPT, but it says that even the Tlatelolco contracting parties may carry out explosions of nuclear devices for peaceful uses. Well, all of that is old history, because peaceful nuclear explosions are completely prohibited under the CTBT, because the CTBT talks about all nuclear explosive devices and doesn't distinguish between nuclear weapons or devices. So this is the Sedan crater. The Soviet Union did a similar test and actually hit an underwater reservoir or underwater river, and it filled up as a lake, and of course the lake was contaminated. This one here on the left, they plan to blow out a deep water harbor in Alaska, supposedly for also to enhance fishing. Of course, the local community objected, and it was scuttled. But I think the craziest of them all, and this is not fiction, all right? This was a project that was driven by Los Alamos Nuclear Lab, and was primarily, the motivation was that fears, given the Suez Canal closure after the Israeli-Egyptian war, there were concerns that the Panama Canal may be closed, and that could have a huge impact on international shipping. And so these scientists had this idea of creating panatomic canals by placing thermonuclear weapons in certain areas and opening up new canals. Of course, that was scuttled, but the thinking was there, which I find quite horrific. So consequences, when things go wrong, and a lot of things went wrong. These are just images of, say, the one Bainbury was an underground test that something went wrong. It's clearly not underground, and added to a lot of nuclear fallout. I just want to focus on one because it came up in an earlier discussion last week about the humanitarian and environmental impact of nuclear testing. So this is the Bikini Atoll, the Castle Bravo test. And this is an error. It should be 15 megatons and not 15 kilotons. This is a test that was conducted in the Bikini Atoll in what is today the Marshall Islands. The test went wrong. It was far more powerful than planned and impacted a Japanese fishing vessel that was supposed to be outside the area. And you can see here the downwind effect. But the tragic part of this for today is that after the United States concluded many tests that it did in the Bikini Atoll, it took all the materials and liquids and rubbish that was left over after the test and dumped it into a crater that was created by one of the tests that they lined with concrete, and they put this concrete dome over it. And you see, this was an earlier picture of that concrete dome. Well, that thing is leaking, and it has been leaking for a while. This is a more recent picture. You can see in the background there's actually a crater of another test, and this resulted in the Marshallese actually taking the United States to court. There's some efforts to remediate the situation, But of course, this is the Marshall Island, and we had a speaker earlier who was actually a teacher in the Marshall Islands, and she had knowledge of this. But they face two concerns. The area is still as contaminated as the Chernobyl reactor, and two, the water levels are rising. So not only will they lose their island, but can you imagine what will happen when the water level rises above this dome? So a very, very sad consequence of nuclear testing. This is the downwind effect. The irony is, you know, all the tests of the United States occurred mostly in this part of the world, and people were in the height of the testing in the 60s and 70s, even as far up as Vermont, were impacted by serious high doses of iodine-131. The final point here is just a kind of an interesting twist of history. These four scientists or activists rented or chartered a boat called Greenpeace to go and to protest a nuclear test of the United States up in Alaska, and eventually was banned from doing so. And they finally established the organization that we now know as Greenpeace. Their vessel much later sailed into the French nuclear testing area in the Pacific, and the French saboteurs sank the vessel and led to an international outcry from New Zealand, and actually paved the way again to the international attention to nuclear testing, which then established the nuclear test ban treaty. So before I dwell a little bit on that, let me just say that, because this, and I'm sure Ambassador Campuzano may also reflect this, because I know this is an ongoing debate in the CTBTO. Since nuclear testing, physical yield-bearing testing, is no longer allowed under the CTBT, states with nuclear weapons, particularly the United States, have conducted different kinds of non-explosive testing. And in fact, had it not been for these technologies, you can argue that the United States and other nuclear weapon states would not have signed the CTBT. But these are tests such as hydronuclear tests that study nuclear materials under conditions of explosive shock compression, but there's no yield. Or subcritical cold tests where there's no fissile material, they use high explosives. Or computer simulations where thousands and thousands, or the results of thousands of tests are obviously used to look at the, instead of, as I mentioned, the purposes like the weapons effect or the safety tests, so they use that instead. It's become a bit controversial though, and I do recognize the efforts also by CELAC for putting this issue right in the front by saying that this undermines the purposes and principles of the CTBT, because the purpose and principles was to not only ban the actual test, but through banning the test, making it more difficult to develop and maintain nuclear weapons, therefore leading to their eventual elimination. So let's move quickly to, and I know the ambassador is also going to talk about this, so I will not spend too much time on it. All I'm going to point out here, of course, the treaty was negotiated in the Conference on Disarmament, but it was not by consensus. So it came out of the Conference on Disarmament and was moved to New York to be voted on. And then, of course, it was open for signature. I want to sort of just focus on President Clinton's quote, that it is the longest sought and hardest fought prize in the history of arms control. That was 1996. I maintain that that quote is still very valid. The treaty has, like all treaties, the very first article or first 3 articles lay out the purpose, and it's very clear that each state party undertakes not to carry out any nuclear test explosion or any other nuclear explosion. Also to make sure that you don't encourage others to do so. So for its time, a very forward-looking treaty. The treaty establishes an organization in Vienna that is still not in place because the treaty is not in force. But the organization is tasked to develop and maintain a global verification regime, to implement measures to redress contraventions, and also settlements of disputes. So it has a very interesting confidence building mechanism in it. And then it unfortunately says very clearly the entry into force of the treaty will take place 180 days after the ratification of all 44 states listed in Annex 2. Now, these states were listed when the treaty was finally negotiated in the last month. This formula was designed based on the number of states that the IEA listed as having nuclear research reactors or nuclear power reactors on this. The other part of the list was the members of the Conference on Disarmament, and that's where the 44 number comes from. In 1996, once the treaty was signed, the General Assembly also passed a resolution to establish the Preparatory Commission for the CTBTO, and that is actually what the organization's name is. But I can tell you, having worked there for almost 8 years, there's nothing preparatory about that organization. It is a fully fledged international organization, unlike what the title suggests. And so even if the treaty never enters into force, I believe that the organization still holds a lot of value. Here's just a map with all the member states. You can see there's 170 ratifying states, 185 signatory states. I'd like to pay tribute also to Cuba, who signed the treaty in February this year. This was my job when I was with the organization, is to go after ratifications. Unfortunately, the last Annex 2 state that ratified was Indonesia way back, and so we are in a stalemate. And this is the problem. DPRK, India, Pakistan have not yet signed the treaty. They're required to ratify for the treaty to enter force. And China, Egypt, Iran, Israel, and the United States have signed but have not yet ratified. The organization is, as I said, is a preparatory commission, but it serves two purposes. One, it's the organization, but two, the preparatory commission also refers to the actual political body. So you call the General Assembly, or you call the IEA General Conference. Well, the preparatory commission is also the main body of representatives, where Ambassador Campuzano is also a member of. So it has two main mandates: promote the treaty and establish the verification regime, and then also prepare for the implementation of the treaty once it enters into force. It has a provisional technical secretariat, which will become the technical secretariat of the CTBTO. Its current executive secretary is Dr. Lassina Zerbo, but the election of the new executive secretary, and also a person that I know well and I have a lot of respect for, Dr. Robert Floyd, will take over in a few days. Well, in about 2 weeks time, in the 1st of August. So I expect, and I'm sure Ambassador Campuzano can say more about that things will start changing a little bit in the organization, and some new ideas will come in. Once the treaty enters into force, there will be an organization. I want to draw attention to the central logo. I'm particularly proud that I was the person who was tasked to design and come up with the CTBTO flag. And Ambassador Campuzano may know that there is the words Preparatory Commission is very small on that flag. And between Ambassador Dr. Zerbo and myself, we decided to keep the letters very, very small. So when you see the flag, you actually don't really see the Preparatory Commission. But besides that, this is just kind of what the organization will look like once it enters into force. Elements of the non-proliferation, the regime designed to prevent nuclear testing. And the first and foremost of that is the international monitoring system linked to the IDC. I would call this the largest alarm system in the world. It consists of 337 facilities, of which 321 of them are stations. These are stations that are seismic. Don't worry about the blue and green dots. They're all seismic stations designed to detect underground tests. Hydroacoustic stations, there are only a few of them, 11, but they're very powerful stations in the water to detect primarily underwater testing. Infrasound and radionuclide stations, those are the sort of salmon-colored squares and little purplish diamonds. They are there I beg your pardon, the radionuclide station are the salmon squares to detect radionuclides released as a result of testing. And finally, infrasound to detect the sound released by nuclear tests. Here's an example of what these stations look like. And you can see there are quite a large number of them. I want to just point out that a hydroacoustic station is extremely expensive. Some years ago, while I was at the organization, the colleagues may recall that there was a huge tsunami off the coast of Chile. And so this station over here, the tsunami actually destroyed the cables and the physical station on the beach, and to replace that station cost $22 million. So this is an extremely expensive system to maintain. How it all works: each of the stations have a satellite dish and a decoder that decodes the actual data that it collects, and that satellite data is transmitted via satellites that the CTBTO does not own, but rents satellite time from, and that is then beamed down to the International Data Center in Vienna. It is at the same time beamed down to national data centers. So each country has a national data center, and this is what makes this treaty really unique. Unlike the IEA, where the IEA Secretariat controls the information. Here, the information is actually controlled by the national authorities. So in the event of a nuclear test, the CTBTO Secretariat cannot determine whether it's a nuclear test. Only the states can do so through data. So this requires a very large infrastructure that is maintained by the CTBTO, paid for by the CTBTO, but owned by the national states. So all the stations are in fact owned by the national authorities, and so is the data, by the way. It makes it very, very, very democratic. Just to give you an example, and this map is a little dated. This is the number of events that the IDC, the International Data Center, have analyzed. Now, I have to point out that, of course, earthquakes occur sometimes kilometers deep. So those are automatically thrown out. So those are not included in this map. So if you look at the depth here, you'll see some of them over here. What the CTBTO is concerned about are the more lower ones, but they have to analyze all of these. So all these events have been analyzed, one by computers, two by humans. And somewhere in here, you will find seven dots that are in this magnitude area. And those were obviously the tests by North Korea. I was asked this question. I don't know if anyone would ask, give me the right answer. Which of these two represents a nuclear test and which is an earthquake? Anyone? Oh.
I would say the earthquake is the one at your, the one with no yellow in the image.
This one is the earthquake?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Why do you say that?
Because it seems more uniform, kind of.
Yeah. Well, it's actually the opposite. this earthquake, and you know, I don't want to go into all the scientific issues here, but there are different waves, P waves and S waves, and how they travel through the earth. But the earthquake kind of reminds you of a train coming past. You know, if you stand at a train crossing, you hear, then you feel the rumbling coming, and then it comes around and it goes past. Where an explosion is a very loud noise, and then the rumbling tapers off. So, but it is, I have to point out, and I'm sure Ambassador Campuzano has received briefings on this, that this was in fact the first test by North Korea. And it was a fairly easy one because it was fairly small. But typically, a nuclear test would create an earthquake. And that would then kind of camouflage the signals. And so it's very, very complicated for scientists to detect that. Speaking of North Korea, this is the detection of the tests as seen by the variety of stations all over the world. And you may ask, well, why were there only 22 stations that picked up the 2006 test while there were so many more later on? Well, of course, the stations were built and the signals became far more powerful. Importantly, for the treaty to, once the treaty is in force, it will allow for the organization, after approval by the Executive Council, to send in inspections, an inspection team to determine, in fact, whether it was a test. To do that, the treaty requires that there must be an area defined less than 1,000 kilometers for the inspectors to operate in. They can't just go anywhere. And as you can see already, as a result of the North Korean tests over time, that area has, even since 2006, been less than 1,000 square kilometers, which means the accuracy of the system is quite superb. This is another way of looking at. Yesterday, you had a briefing by one of my colleagues on sort of the technologies that you can use. But this is what we use with the CTBTO, just plain Google Maps. And the elliptical circles are created by how the stations see it, and you can clearly see, if you zoom in, you can see the tunnels of the North Korean test site. The other thing that is used is animated models based on a lot of data coming from radio, from weather and other stations, on how the wind patterns will affect the fallout. And this is used essentially to make sure that the stations downwind are ready and capable. But if you play the model in reverse, obviously you can also see where it came from. This was extremely helpful in the case of the Fukushima accident, where the organization was on the forefront of assisting states to kind of know when this is going to come, what the levels of radioactivity would be, etc. Finally, and then I just want to look at a few challenges, is once the treaty is into force, there will be an inspection regime. And this inspection regime is, the on-site inspection division is preparing for that, but the treaty is not in force. And that will require, once there is an accusation of a nuclear test, that the Executive Council give a green light by voting with 30 affirmative votes to send an inspection team in. These pictures are from two fake inspections that were conducted to test. One was in Kazakhstan and one was in Jordan, just to test all the different kinds of equipment. But you can imagine that it takes a lot of effort. So 150 tons of equipment was shipped to Jordan. 364 people were there from 53 countries. They stayed there for more than a month. It was a massively huge and very expensive exercise, but done to make sure that once a treaty is enforced, that you don't have to start all these things from the beginning. Treaty is not enforced. How do we get there? Well, the treaty has built into it the idea that until entry into force, there will be a conference every 2 years. Other high-level meetings are being held. There's a group of eminent persons that were established. I think one of the strongest supporters of the treaty and continues to be so, even though he's no longer Secretary General, was Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He used to say, his last name is Ban, and so he was always very supportive of the treaty. I'm going to stop here because I want to also obviously listen to Ambassador Campuzano. But I do have a few slides that I want to share perhaps later in doing Q&A, which I find which are the critical challenges of this treaty. And the picture here, and I want you to start thinking about it, is the one of the famous was a book and a film that was made about the perfect storm. And to me, the CTBT is this small fishing boat, having to ride out this storm. So we can talk about that a little bit later. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you very much, Natalia. It's very generous, your introduction. And thank you also very much to Mr. Jean Dupré, who has made an extremely thorough presentation of the CTBTO. And even we learned a lot. So we are very, very thankful to you, Mr. Jean Dupré. We want to thank also the Instituto Matías Romero, the OPANAL, and of course the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Study for allowing us to participate today in this summer school on non-proliferation and nuclear disarmaments for diplomats from Latin America and the Caribbean. Without further ado, I want also to introduce my colleague, Marco Negrete, who is accompanying me in this occasion and who is really the expert in the CTBT. And it's really a privilege to count with him within this mission, because he is one of these young diplomatic promises that I'm certain that in the future you will hear a lot about him. He has been distinguished in all the organizations where he has taken part, has been one of very, very talented Mexican diplomat, and that's why I thought it was much better to have him with me in the presentation today to young diplomats of Latin America and the Caribbean. So we will then pass to the presentation that we have prepared to you. It will be, of course, we will be repeating some of the issues that were presented very thoroughly by Mr. Jean Dupré, but we think that we hope that this will make the complete framework of what the CTBT stands for, and also from the history of it. So let's start without any further delay. Although only 2 nuclear bombs have been detonated in a context of war, over 2,000 nuclear bombs have been detonated to test by at least 8 countries: USA, USSR, Russia, UK, France, China, India, Pakistan, and DPRK, and possibly Israel and South Africa. The proliferation of nuclear weapons depends on nuclear testing, not only as a technical step in the process of developing nuclear weapons, but also as a demonstrative political message in it and of itself. Nuclear testing is perceived as key to demonstrate status of nuclear armed states.
At the same time, because of the unique nature of nuclear explosions, all nuclear testing has what economists would describe as high negative externalities. In this case, adverse and long-lasting effects on the health and well-being of persons as well as the environment. These externalities emerge with all nuclear tests, and as Jean Dupré mentioned, they emerged when they went right and also when things went wrong, which happened several times. And nuclear testing has literally changed the world. One of the main parameters considered by scientists as a marker of the Anthropocene, which is the geologic time unit shaped by human activity, are the radionuclides linked to nuclear test explosions, especially between 1945 and 1963.
The drive behind the CTBT. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty must be understood in the framework of the wider nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. One way to understand the CTBT is to look at it through the lens of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and its so-called grand bargain. Simplifying, as this has been already fully covered by other experts of this summer school under the NPT, A, states with nuclear weapons committed to disarming. B, states without nuclear weapons undertake not to acquire or develop them. And C, it is recognized that all states that have the right to benefit from the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology. As in many areas, one of the main drivers behind the NPT was arguably the interest of nuclear weapon states to preserve the perceived strategic advantage of possessing nuclear weapons. And in essence, the NPT has fully served that interest by fixing legally recognized nuclear weapon states and raising technical, legal, economic, and political barriers to the development and acquisition.
And as was also mentioned by many of the presenters and by Jean Dupré, testing is the foundation for the development, possession, and political showcasing of nuclear weapons. In this regard, banning nuclear tests serves the purpose of halting the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and thus also the dilution of the perceived strategic advantage by nuclear weapon states. John F. Kennedy mentioned this as the nth country problem in a speech in 1959, which was just before becoming president, which is the quote that you have there. We do not know how many nations may soon possess these weapons, for once China or France or Sweden or half a dozen other nations successfully test an atomic bomb, then the security of both Russians and the Americans is dangerously weakened. This strategic consideration was therefore a primary consideration for the development of the CTBT that was pinpointed since the 1950s. And in this regard, the milestone towards the CTBT was, as was already mentioned, the 1963 treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, which is also known as the PTBT or LTBT.
The PTBT was without a doubt a major milestone and bound the UK, the US, and the USSR to a ban on testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. However, France did not sign, and neither did China, which became the fourth country to test nuclear weapons in 1964. There was a social political incentive to stop nuclear testing. The limits of the PTBT must be understood in function of another driving force at play, the anti-testing movement, which in its origins was intrinsically linked to the movement against nuclear weapons. Nuclear tests, especially nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere and underwater, are harmful to people and the environment. Although this is itself evident to us now, it wasn't the case at the beginning. And some tests even had volunteers stand in the vicinity of explosions to assure populations that there was limited associated risks.
However, as the nuclear tests added up, there were many associated tragedies, and the scientific evidence indicated that nuclear tests carried hazards even for populations far away from test sites. This is an extra extract from the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation that was established in response to this, and in a landmark 2000 report to the General Assembly, established that environmental contamination by radioactive residues resulting from nuclear weapon testing continues to be a global source of human radiation exposure. The main man-made contribution to the exposure of the world's population has come from the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere from 1945 to 1980.
At the national level, many other studies have pointed out the deeply harmful effects of nuclear weapon testing. A key study by Dr. Luis Rice found that children born in St. Louis in 1963 had 50 times as much strontium-90 in the teeth as children born in the 1950s, before most of the atomic tests. The US Environmental Protection Agency today has an entry on its webpage on the continued legacy of nuclear tests in the environment. Strontium-90 is widely dispersed in the environment and the food chain from atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons in the 1950s and the 1960s. Radioactive decay is the only way of decreasing the amount of strontium-90 in the environment. It has been slowly decaying since then. Current levels from the tests are very low. Plants or crops growing in or near contaminated soil may take us up small amounts of strontium-90 from the soil. Animals may ingest strontium-90 when eating plants. A report prepared by the US government estimated that the nuclear testing program in the Marshall Islands caused about 500 additional cancer cases among Marshallese exposed during the years 1946 to 1958, about a 9% increase over the number of cancers expected in the absence of exposure to regional fallout. According to the US government, as of July 2010, compensation had been approved for over 22,000 victims and their families who suffer health problems as a result of exposure to fallout from nuclear weapons development and testing in states including Nevada, Utah, and Arizona.
And this has also been the case, obviously, in other populations affected by nuclear testing. And as a result, in 1986, the Australian government announced compensation to populations living in affected test sites. And there have been several studies in Kazakhstan, especially after it separated from the USSR, where nuclear testing was associated with babies born with neurological diseases, bone deformations, leukemia, and other blood disorders.
More recently, these findings on the effects of nuclear testing were further established during the International Conference on the Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear Weapons, hosted by the governments of Norway, Oslo in March 2013, Mexico in Nayarit, February 2014, and Austria, Vienna, December 2014. From fact-based discussions and analysis in these conferences, it was ascertained that nuclear testing in several parts of the world has left a legacy of serious health and environmental consequences. Radioactive contamination from those tests disproportionately affects women and children. It affected food supplies and continues to be measurable to this day. Testimonies had been reminded policy and decision makers of the imperative to ensure that there will be no more victims in the future. The anti-testing movements must therefore be understood as a result of the growing conscience of the impact of nuclear weapon testing, as well as the acute perception of threat in the Cold War era, and the border anti-colonialist movement, given that much testing occurred in the colonial and minority indigenous territories, like in Algeria, the Pacific, Aboriginal territories in Australia, Kazakhstan, in Xinjiang, etc. These movements, which include the Women's Strike for Peace and the Pugwash conferences, and many local actions, were crucial in pushing for the PTBT and ultimately to the CTBT.
And as you can imagine, there was Nobel Peace Prizes for tracking the progress of the PTBT and the CTBT, and several peace laureates, Nobel Peace Laureates, received their Nobel Prizes based on their activism against nuclear testing. This is just quotations from a few of the Nobel Peace Laureates. Martin Luther King Jr., obviously Alfonso Garcia Robles, as Mexican diplomats were constitutionally obliged to mention him. Also John P. Holdren as the representative of the Committee of the Pugwash Council, and of course Joseph Rotblat, this more closer to the negotiation of the CTBT. And it must be highlighted that the activism against nuclear testing and compensation is still an ongoing movement as files are declassified and governments change. And just this year, investigative journalists in France analyzed declassified files from nuclear testing in the Pacific. And just last weekend, there was a major protest in French Polynesia to mark the 55th anniversary of the first test in the area. And compensation of affected individuals and communities is still an open matter that will probably draw growing attention in the framework of the Future NPT Review Conference, as well as the entry into force of the TPNW.
The CTBT was drafted at a period of transition. As mentioned previously, the PTBT was only a partial success, and between 1964 and 1995, just under 1,500 tests were conducted. France, China, and India, and possibly Israel and South Africa, 1979 Bella incident, also carried out nuclear tests, in addition to those carried out by the UK, the US, and the USSR Russia Federation. Partial attempts to contain the development and testing of nuclear weapons were put in place, including the treaties of Tlatelolco, the Rarotonga, which created nuclear weapons-free zones, the bilateral threshold test ban treaty, 1974, establishing a maximum yield of 150 kilotons, and unilateral moratoria that were more or less respected.
And, also, as Jean Dupré mentioned, from early on, there was an intention from several corners to extend the PTBT into an all-encompassing nuclear test ban treaty. This intention started to gain traction in the 1985 NPT Review Conference, and in 1988, Indonesia, Mexico, Peru, Sri Lanka, Venezuela, and Yugoslavia pushed for the extension of the PTBT into a full CTBT, which is a comprehensive test ban, through treaty amendments. And this was the idea that was picked up in 1991 at the amendment conference that was mentioned by Jean Dupré, which was also obviously convened with pressure from civil society, although it was ultimately blocked by the UK and the US. However, obviously the transition from the USSR to Russia and the concomitant end of the Cold War offered a window of opportunity to advance towards a comprehensive test ban. There was obviously a brief change of paradigm from the bipolar world into the multipolar world of the 1990s. And there was also a push to cash in on the dividend from peace that was expected to draw funds away from military expenditure towards civil budgets, especially in the US, and obviously in Russia that was going through a painful transition to a market economy. Also, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which was negotiated in the Conference on Disarmament, was a positive precedent in this regard. Russia committed to a testing moratorium in 1991, followed by the US in 1983. And in 1994, Mexico's Miguel Marín Bosch was the chair of the Conference on Disarmament that began the negotiations on a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty.
The drafting of the CTBT was a major achievement that drew on the accumulated experience of diplomats and scientists over the 50 years since the beginning of the nuclear era. On the technical and scientific front, the group of scientific experts, GCE, which had been established since 1976, had the necessary technical and scientific expertise to develop the framework of what would become the treaty's verification regime, an international monitoring system with stations spanning the globe, an international data center, and on-site inspections and sensitive issues that eluded negotiations of the PTBT. Well, you heard from Jean Dupré also the importance of having this sensible system through the whole world in order to really to be able to ensure the compliance by all countries to take care of these kind of explosions. On the political side, there were different views of the scope and objective of the treaty. Non-nuclear weapon states understandably sought to link the treaty text to the pre-existing commitment by nuclear weapon states to disarm. Nuclear weapons states sought, on the other hand, to limit the scope of the treaty as much as possible, preserving the status quo and their acquired technology.
And in parallel, as you have probably already seen in many other lectures, the 1995 review conference struck what was then perceived as a renewed deal between nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states, and in exchange for an indefinite extension of the NPT, which until then had only been renewed every 5 years, there was a strengthened commitment to disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. And you've got here on the slide one of the principles and objectives agreed to at the 1995 REPCON, which was the completion by the Conference on Disarmament of the negotiations on a universal and internationally and effectively verifiable CTBT no later than 1996.
Despite this political mandate from the REVCON, the negotiations were difficult. A specific point of contention was the objective of NPT-recognized nuclear weapon states to preserve the capacity to maintain nuclear arsenals, including through limited testing for safety, as well as the use of testing methods such as subcritical testing, where no chain reaching is sustained. Among others, India, Pakistan, and Iran presented strong proposals to link the CTBT to binding disarmament commitments. On the procedural front, the mechanisms for entry into force presented major cleavages, with different formulas presented, ranging from a simple number of ratifications to the ratification by recognized nuclear weapon states, similar to what was established by the CTBT.
And since there was an impasse among the negotiating states, well, what happened was that the chair, the Dutch ambassador Jaap Ramaker, presented a compromise text with this list of 44 Annex 2 states that had to ratify in order for the treaty to enter into force. And also there was an Article 9 clause that includes a quick withdrawal exit for states, citing this concept of supreme interest, where if this is also language from the NPT, where if a state feels that its supreme interest is threatened, they can withdraw from the treaty. However, despite this compromise text, there was no consensus on the adoption presented by the chairperson from the Netherlands, and India in particular objected to the entry into force provisions and the lack of stronger language on disarmament. It is worth noting that this was the first time that the Conference on Disarmament failed to adopt a treaty it had negotiated, and since then the Conference on Disarmament has pretty much been out in the cold and has not been able to engage in substantial discussions on disarmament.
The CTBT underpins the global moratorium of nuclear testing, with vulnerable flanks in its temporary architecture. First, the bright picture. The technical hurdle presented by India in the Conference of Disarmament was overcome by Australia, presenting the CTBT directly to the General Assembly through the Resolution 50/245. The resolution was adopted by 150 votes in favor, 3 against, that was Bhutan, India, and Libya, and 5 abstentions, Cuba, Mauritius, Syria, Lebanon, and Tanzania. There was also a flurry of initial signatures, including by China, France, Russia, UK, and US. Moreover, eager to hit the ground running, a first meeting of signatory states adopted the resolution establishing the CTBTO Preparatory Commission in November 1996 in order to provide the treaty with an institutional structure and start building up its verification regime through the CTBT Preparatory Commission and the Provisional Technical Secretariat. Since then, in line with the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, signatory states have, for all intents and purposes, observed a test moratorium.
And I won't get into this because Chandra presented it very eloquently. Suffice to say that, as you mentioned, keeping the stations going online and repairing the aging, especially hydroacoustic station, takes a lot of time and a lot of budget, which was made difficult during the pandemic last year. Especially in Mexico, we have a hydroacoustic station on Isla Socorro, and it was impossible to repair the station since we have to get a boat from the Navy to go visit the island, and that is a very time-consuming task. This is obviously the same map that Chandra mentioned, and we will link to a very nice video from the CTBTO outlining how the IMS works.
The technical and scientific component of the CTBT has made important progress since the establishment of the CTBTO in Vienna in 1997, joining the nuclear governance ecosystem in Vienna. The verification regime has advanced to the point where it has, as it was pointed by John Dupré, to this date certified 302 stations of the international monitoring system, equivalent to 90% of the network foreseen by the treaty. And the International Data Center is up and running for all intents and purposes. It's very important to say that many countries have also national data centers that are linked directly. And as Jean Dupré mentioned, it's a very democratic system because it helps the access for all countries to this valuable information that has not only the intents that were originally for the treaty to monitor the nuclear testing, but also of other natural effects as seisms and the tsunamis. Then we have also the on-site inspection, which remains a sensitive component of the verification regime that have made headway in establishing guidelines and carried out joint exercises, reaffirming their value as confidence-building mechanism. And of course, the proof is in the pudding. In the 21st century, only the DPRK has carried out nuclear tests, and the 5 tests that it has carried out have been detected by the IMS. It is thus undeniable that the treaty has enough political weight to hold a testing moratorium and enough technical capacity to detect nuclear tests. Moreover, the verification regime has offered new civil and scientific applications, including the disaster risk reduction.
However, there's of course still no mission accomplished. The treaty has always faced adversity, and it's worth noting that as the treaty was being negotiated, France and China hurried to make some last test explosions. And in 1988, the two countries that had spoken very much in favor of strong disarmament language, Pakistan and India, carried out their own nuclear tests. As of today, it is a very difficult path to ratification and subsequent entry into force. Clinton was unable to get the treaty passed in the US Senate during his term in office. And since then, it has been a rocky ride. George W. Bush declined to pursue ratification. Trump obviously did not pursue ratification either, and even threatened to carry out renewed tests. And Obama, although had a lot of rhetoric in favor of the CTBT, did not put any political capital on the table to get it passed in the Senate.
And as the treaty ages without coming into force, institutional, financial, and political problems have started to accumulate. On the technical front, some major stations, especially hydroacoustic stations, require progressively more expensive repairs. You just heard also from Jean Dupré what happened with this station in front of Chile. On-site inspection will probably not make major progress unless there is a foreseeable entry into force, in particular through the ratification of the US and China. Certain countries have also sought to limit the scope of action of the CTBTO, for example, by limiting background measurements of noble gases. In 2019, Russia brought several stations offline following an incident allegedly involving accidental explosions. Since the treaty has not yet entered into force, the transmission of data from national stations is voluntary. This is once again one of the faults of not having the treaty enter into force and making this transmission compulsory.
And politically, as Jean Dupré mentioned, there is a strong push by nuclear open states to continue to modernize nuclear arsenal, as is the case in China of the UK, and also the fact that they carry out subcritical testing and testing using supercomputers obviously means that for us, Mexico, and for the members of OPANAL, the spirit of the treaty is not being respected. And this was once again very much evident last year. It was only last year that Trump threatened to carry out the test, as I mentioned. And last year, there's a resolution that is usually presented at the General Assembly on the CTBT. At one point, it was only the DPRK voting against it, but last year it was the DPRK and the US voting against this resolution. So institutionally, the Preparatory Commission, which Jean Dupré quoted as being more established, being in the trenches, we see it as as a little bit more shaky. And it's becoming progressively a labyrinth of ad hoc decisions to solve emerging problems, such as the recent appointment of the executive secretary, which is easily put on a slide, but which came about through a lot of concoctions and a lot of unforeseen negotiations. So this is the technical and institutional challenge of the CTBTO at this point.
As in the case in other areas of multilateralism, the reconfiguration of geopolitical rivalries is preventing the consolidation of that treaty that should be a solid pillar of nuclear non-proliferation disarmament and a check against the threat of any and all nuclear explosions. Today, as before, the fully observance institutionalization of a comprehensive ban on nuclear testing will probably only be possible through a mobilization of civil society, political will, and making the most of any windows that come on our way.
And just really wrapping up on a realistic note, we can conclude with the comments that were made by the Mexican delegation at the conclusion of the negotiations of the CTBT, which is on your screen, which in essence say that this 44 Annex 2 states is very tricky and ambitious and maybe not possible. But at the same time, the treaty will create a precedent, a legally binding obligation on states not to carry out nuclear weapons tests, and hopefully contribute to disarmament in this regard. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and also Marco. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your expertise. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting to hear like the history of how the CTBT was achieved and what led to it, and also about the participation of your country, of Mexico, in the work of the CTBTO. So thank you for that. We have 12 minutes left before the session ends. So I will now open the floor for questions and answers session. So if anybody has any question, please write in the chat or raise a hand. And yes, John.
Sorry to interrupt, but if I may just make a two-finger comment in reaction to the very good presentation by our colleagues from the Mexican mission. A couple of references were made to the supposed test by Israel in South Africa, and I want to assure Ambassador Campuzano that as someone who had deep insight into the South African program, there was no such test. So I just would appreciate if those references are removed. In fact, it would have been impossible for South Africa to conduct a test because they didn't have fissile material at the time. The timing of that collaboration is completely. If you look at the history of the program, there was definitely not a nuclear test. Now you can argue, as some analysts, including Israeli analysts, have argued, that it may have been an Israeli test, but the nature of the flash that was detected by the Vela satellite also suggested a completely different kind of test than the one that South Africa would have tested. South Africa didn't need to test because it used a gun type device. The type of test that was the flash that was appeared was reminiscent of a trigger device that is used in thermonuclear weapons. So I just wanted to point that out, but other than that, I thought it was a very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Jean. While we are waiting for questions from our audience, I actually wanted to ask you a question. So the CTBT has its unique entry into force formula, right? So we have the Annex 2 states, 44 states, and 8 of them are still pending to sign and ratify the treaty. So we need the signature and the ratification of 8 more states for the treaty to enter into force. So there are a lot of debate regarding whether this formula should be changed in order to bring the treaty into force, or some argue that this is like the ratification of those eight remaining states is crucial, and it is very important to have those 8 states on board for the functioning of the treaty. So just wanted to ask your opinion on that and what you think about this entry into force formula. Anybody, Ambassador or Marco or Jean?
You're muted, Ambassador.
Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, only to recall that this was one of the most difficult clauses within the negotiation of the treaty, how the entry into force mechanism. And there were, for example, the Mexican delegation presented the formula of the Tlatelolco Treaty, but it was not accepted. And it was for especially the request of the nuclear weapon states to have all countries that, from their perspective, had the possibility of having the knowledge or nuclear reactors at that time that should be included within this list. So this was extremely difficult. This was one of the formulations that the ambassador of the Netherlands presented in his formula, and that actually was able to get the acceptance. But still, it was, even though it was accepted within, there was not consensus within the CD, and actually it had the action by Australia to bring it directly to the General Assembly. But and there's, unfortunately, from our perspective, no possibility of making any change on that formula.
Natalia, if I could also weigh in, I fully agree with the ambassador that there's no possibility to change that formula. There has been, and I remembered when I was at the CTBTO and even before, especially in among civil society, all sorts of formulas about, provisional entry into force and this, that, the other thing. The treaty is a treaty. A treaty has specific provisions on how it will be amended. It needs to enter into force before it can be amended. And so the more important thing that the ambassador alluded to is that if you're going to do that, you're going to basically say to the countries that have not yet ratified, including those with nuclear weapons, many of them do, and including one country that continues to test, the treaty doesn't apply to you. So what are you going to do if one of those countries test? Because the treaty doesn't apply to them. So the treaty becomes completely irrelevant. So I've always, even at the CTBTO, resisted all these attempts. The only way to get this treaty into force is to make sure that those countries that ratify. But I want to add here, if I may, that after 23 years of trying to do that, or even more, the question then comes up: what happens if the treaty never enters into force? And I can be brutally honest with you, despite, Natalia, your very optimistic outlook when you introduced the thing that it will happen in our lifetime. Well, I'm almost 60 years old, and I hope it's going to happen in my lifetime. But if you think about it, if it doesn't, what does the treaty then actually mean, right? I mean, will anyone test? And if, say, the United States test or Russia test or so on, what are we going to do about it? And I think the most important part is not necessarily the entry into force, but is to maintain the system. And I forgot to introduce what's behind me on the screen is actually the inside of the International Data Center. And it's the older version of the data center that the ambassador may recognize. But I spent a lot of my time in that room, and that's where it's at. I am actually convinced that the organization spends too much time emphasizing the entry into force. what needs to be emphasized is the maintaining of the system, because that is what makes the treaty important. The Security Council can act as it did in all the cases with North Korea, based on data collected by the IMS, can act on that. I just wanted to point out that, I think efforts to try and force the treaty into force as opposed to using the treaty as it is at the moment, to my mind is frivolous. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you so much for your comments, your answers. Do we have any questions? Costa Rica.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you also for the presentations. It's been very, very interesting to listen to both of you. I do have, if I'm allowed, 2 questions. The first being a technical one to Jan, and excuse me for my ignorance, but with the sophistication that we have today, is there a trend that we do not need testings, or we always will need that? That would be my technical question. And also for the ambassador, Campuzano and Mr. Negrete, also, I wanted to ask, in line with what Jan already mentioned, that if the CTBT treaty could be seen, or it is seen by the nuclear, or not only the nuclear, but by some countries, like a delayed strategy to actually allow them to keep on building their nuclear capacity, whereas I remember the first times that I was getting involved into this, that I was explained by some Costa Rican diplomats that that they would see, of course this is not Costa Rican position, but only their personal ones, that they would see a trend in the disarmament framework, that some countries will use treaties that are not being into effect, that are not current, as a delay mechanism in order for them to keep on building their nuclear programs. Whereas we, for example, we have the TPNW, in which that is a complete ban for our nuclear arsenal. I don't know if that makes sense. I just wanted to ask if you see that the CTBTO could be seen as a delay mechanism for some countries. Thank you.
Natalia, do you want me to respond? You want the ambassador to go first?
As you wish.
Okay, I'll briefly respond on the technical, and again, I'm a political scientist and not a physicist, but so let me, based on my understanding and having had to just explain this to delegations also in Vienna, there are a variety of different non-explosive testing that can be done. I listed a few. And computer simulations is based on data already collected. So one can, you can argue, for instance, and I've seen these arguments, well, computers have developed so much so, the iPhone or phone that you have with you has far more computing capabilities than the computers used to design the first nuclear weapons. And this is a small little device. So arguments are that, computers are so powerful now that you can actually design from scratch a nuclear weapon. Well, that is apparently not possible. The tests that are conducted, for instance, at Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Lab, which is about 100 miles north of where I am at the moment, or in Nevada, or in Novaya Zemlya in Russia, uses non-explosive testing, but they are using existing nuclear material. So I'll give you a quick example. So they take a small quantity, minute quantity of plutonium from one warhead that represent a series of warheads that are all the same, right? And then they take, they put this on a little, it's almost like a tip of a needle. And they put this under a huge laser. And they test the stability of the material, to ensure that that gives them then data that the material in all the other weapons are safe and secure. Or they test the electronics package of it, and so to say that this can actually develop new nuclear weapons is not technically correct. There's a gray area, however. So the United States, and I'm not only talking about the US, but I know more about the US program, is planning to develop new plutonium pits based on existing designs, right? But they take the pits from old weapons and they're going to put them in new weapons. So the pits remain the same, but the weapon is different. But they don't have to test the weapon because they know the pits will work, right? So, so this to me, and this is why I referred to the CELAC declaration in 2016, which, you know, I was there and we were preparing for that was the 20th anniversary of the treaty signature. So it was a major event that we held, and CELAC, the heads of state came out with a statement in support of the treaty and so on. But part of that statement contained this language, and I don't have it in front of me, but it basically that the subcritical testing in these kind of non-explosive testing conducted by nuclear weapon states undermine the spirit of the CTBT. And I think that is an extremely important point. Having left the CTBTO, I fully subscribe to that. I do believe that as time goes on, you will see that the treaty becomes irrelevant because nuclear weapon states are using technology to test the reliability and safety of their weapons, but they have the weapons. So for them to, they can't, I mean, they're not going to develop new, if they want to develop a radically new weapon, they probably have to test, but they don't need to do so. So the treaty is only relevant to catch the others. Well, North Korea, we know is testing, and hopefully they will not. So who else is the treaty focused on? Countries that do not have nuclear weapons yet and that may test. And so I've come to the conclusion that more and more, as more you have this non-explosive testing, this high-tech ways of doing so, the more you do damage to the credibility of the CTBT.
I would like.
Yes,
I would like.
go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I would like to add only something very briefly. I would recommend you to read the article by Ambassador Marín Bosch in the Revista Mexicana de Política Exterior. It's I think it's the 75 book, and it's called 6 décadas de negociaciones multilaterales de desarme. 6 decades of multilateral disarmament negotiation. And here, well, one of the highlights that he presents here are that many of these very, very important international disarmament treaties have been really related to a unilateral decision by the US to end up the use of some different kind of armaments. As it happened with the biological armaments, it was Nixon who decided unilaterally not to use them in the arms stock in 1969. And 2 years later, the UK presented the proposal to negotiate a treaty to prohibit this kind of arms. The same happened with the chemical weapons. After the first Gulf War, actually they realized that the army, the US Army realized that they were able to win even with conventional sophisticated arms, a very, very highly professional and armed army that even had this kind of weapons of mass destruction, but it was not more necessary. So they started with the negotiation. The same happened with CTBT. In 1993, President Clinton declared a unilateral moratorium because they have reached a very high level of sophistication with the computer and the other kind of technological ways to take care of the performance of their nuclear arms, and also the efficiency and the development. So these are absolutely facts that they are behind this kind of treaties that in some kind make them less comprehensive as they should be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And the link to the article which Ambassador was referring to is already in the chat. So feel free to read it. Jean, we have 2 more raised hands, and I don't know. No, actually, we do have more, like 4, 5. So I don't know if we have time, or shall we wrap up?
No, I mean, depending if the ambassador has time in Vienna, I certainly have time. So, you know, why don't we go have a few more questions?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ambassador and Jean. I will now pass the floor to my colleague and friend, Alan Ponce Blancos, who wanted to ask a question.
Thank you, Natalia. And thank you, Ambassador Jean, Marco, for this very interesting presentation on the CTBT and like all the challenges faced by the treaty after 25 years of its creation. So I was wondering, like, what would be, in your opinion, like the best way to engage with those states that are pending its either signature or ratification in order to enter into force, and also there has been like some proposals, especially by young professionals, young diplomats within the framework of the CTBTO youth group. I remember reading a couple of proposals, just like how to get involved, like for instance, Pakistan and India, by convincing them or providing some ideas or explaining to them the benefits of joining the international monitoring system, and just like the possibilities that they could actually be part of this system, and just like to allow the installation of these facilities. So in your view, that could be like a practical way to move forward in spite of their pending ratification? Thank you.
John, you want to go ahead?
I'd like to hear the ambassador's response to that one.
So sorry, I would suggest, can we pick up already the 4 questions so that we can take it together? Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so I will now give the floor to Fernanda from Mexico.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Ambassador Marco, very nice to see you. Thank you for all the explanations you gave. And I don't know if the question is for you back in Vienna, for Jan here, after the assessment that you'd made on the treaty and the many obstacles for the entry into force of the CTBT, could we conclude, and I'm sorry to be the party pooper, by the way, but could we conclude that it's just a deterrence measure? That would be it. Thanks.
Thank you, Fernanda. And now Enrique Delgado Rios.
Thank you, John Preez again, and thank you, Ambassador, for the presentation. So I have 2 questions that are actually related to Fernanda's question. I mean, the first is, since, because of all the reasons that have already been explained, the treaty hasn't been ratified, and it seems unlikely that it will happen that way in the following years. Do you see that as more of a deterrence measure And or did you see like more countries? I mean, those 8 countries that haven't ratified the treaty, just maintaining the moratorium without ratifying the treaty. But my second question is actually in this way as well. So despite the fact that the treaty hasn't been ratified by the United States, do you think that the CTBT has itself become customary international law for the United States? I mean, I know that there is a big discussion on that, especially because the Vienna Convention was signed by the United States in 1970, but it hasn't been ratified yet. And nevertheless, considered as customary international law for the United States. So do you think that is going to happen the same with the CTBT for the United States? Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. Ambassador, do you want to start?
I'll give the floor now to Marco. He wants to say something, but
I don't know if the ambassador will agree with me. We'll see. First, on the entry into force, one of the challenges is that it's no longer the subject at the top of the hour in the news. So there's little political pressure in the domestic political context of the U.S., for example, which is a major obstacle to entry into force. And given that, it is very important that civil society pick up the slack, and the CTBTO youth group will be important to make sure that it remains visible, that as young people become decision makers, they bring the CTBT as a relevant policy mechanism that should be taken up by decision makers in the respective countries, especially in Article 2 countries. There are great CTBTO youth members in India and Pakistan who are talking across the political divide in those 2 countries, and that can see the political benefits of entry into force from a security perspective, meaning that they won't have to worry about another nuclear weapon test, from an environmental perspective, but also from a budget perspective, because there are democracies in place in Pakistan and India, and there is a trade-off between nuclear testing and nuclear programs, and investment in social development. So that is important, but at the same time, there will have to be a political push at the highest level. And in all honesty, I don't know how that is going to happen. And this is where I hand off to the ambassador in case he has better ideas.
Thank you very much. It's not better ideas, only other issues. First of all, regarding the issue of, for example, India and Pakistan, we have to remember that India voted against in the CD. Was one of the main countries that caused that there was no consensus. And one of the observations that they had was precisely that the CTBTO was not linked to a very strong disarmament commitment by nuclear weapon states. So this is one of the weakness of the treaty. From this perspective, it's very, very difficult. They are also not signatories or for the NPT, and the CTBTO, they have not signed it, and of course not ratified. You can also see another weakness in the treaty with this clause that countries can argue that for their supreme interests that they have to restart nuclear testing. This is something that how you can put the supreme interest from a security perspective. If this happens to those countries that have nuclear weapons, what can you argue for a country that has no nuclear weapons? Where their security concerns? So this is once again one of the weaknesses. On the other side, we have to see the actual situation. Fortunately, since the entry into force, since the signature of the CTBT in 1996, we have only 3 countries that have done nuclear testing. One, both India and Pakistan, that were in the 90s. And in this century, it has been only the DPRK. So if you relate this to more than 2,000 nuclear testing in the previous 4 decades, actually it's a huge step for humanity that we don't have this kind of testings. Of course, you can argue, yes, the countries that have nuclear tests, nuclear weapons can continue the modernization. But we have had this kind of claims, for example, by the Trump administration, that they said that they would restart nuclear testing. And even the UK has also said that. So from this perspective, taking into account this question of customary law, well, some countries, they don't even would care to go against this spirit. But I think that this is once again one of the great values of the treaty. It has created a political muscle and a technical capacity in order to try to prevent this kind of testing. So from this perspective, we have, of course, a very, very good thing for humanity. We have in some way prevented the horizontal proliferation, and to a big degree the vertical proliferation or vertical armamentism in nuclear weapons is of course not constrained because of all the technological progress with the computers and even with the artificial intelligence nowadays.
Thank you. Lots of good questions, and I also agree with what the ambassador and Marco just said. On the issue of deterrence, yes, it is. It is a treaty that is designed to deter states from detonating nuclear explosive devices. And again, coming back to my analogy with an alarm system. If you have an alarm system at your home, you typically have a sign outside that this property is protected by blah, or maybe you have a big dog or something, and you say, beware of the dog. Well, this is the dog, right? So I always, when I was there, used to say, this is the big fancy Mercedes that you have in your garage, and you only pull it out maybe on every Sunday to drive around the block, and then you put it back in. And in the meantime, you polish it and you make sure everything works fine. But it is a showcase of the world's ability to detect nuclear tests. And so if you want to detect if you want to do a nuclear test, they will catch you. No matter what you do, they will catch you. And I think that, and the ambassador mentioned India. This is not a disarmament treaty. I want to be very blunt about that. It creates the environment in which dismantlement of nuclear weapons can take place. You cannot imagine that the nuclear weapon states would start lowering their numbers at a time when there were 180 tests in 1 year. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So the treaty contributes, and this is the second point I want to make. It is a tool in the non-proliferation disarmament toolbox. It's not a singular tool. It works well with safeguards. So I've kind of described this as the downstream mechanism from safeguards. Safeguards is also a mechanism to deter. Safeguards is the legal upstream mechanism by the IEA to make sure that states do not divert their military, their civilian material and technologies to military purposes. The CTBT is that last waterfall. If you go over that waterfall and you test, then you have a nuclear weapon capability. So these two mechanisms are part of the tools. And so I find sometimes too much emphasis is placed on the one single part. It should be seen bigger. On the issue of customary law, again, it depends on how you define customary law. We had a long discussion on the TPNW. The TPNW is customary law. The TPNW has entered into force, but the TPNW doesn't apply to nuclear weapon states because they've not signed it. In this case, it's different because you actually have nuclear weapon states that have signed the treaty, and the reference was made to the Vienna Convention on Treaties. And so in terms of that, states should do nothing that would harm the purposes and objectives of a treaty that they have signed. President Bush, George W. famously said the United States should unsign the CTBT. Well, that's unprecedented. No state has ever unsigned a treaty. I mean, do you take an eraser to the big book in New York and you go and unsign it? You can't do that. I want to just share one, and this is more about the entry into force. I have one slide that I want to quickly share with you. Just as I said, one slide. And this is a slide that I was always asked, will there be a domino effect if the United States ratify this treaty? And the point here is not about the domino effect. First of all, I believe that there will not be a domino effect, by the way. But the entry into force of this treaty is not just linked to that. It is linked to, the ambassador mentioned India and Pakistan. It's linked to the strategic relationship, which is increasingly of concern between the United States, China, United States, India, and Pakistan. And India is not going to ratify, or Pakistan is not going to ratify this treaty or sign this treaty. Pakistan is actually an observer, and Pakistan, at least in the days that I was there, attended many of the PrepCom meetings. But they're not going to do so until India does. India is going to do nothing until the United States or China does. Israel, Egypt, and Iran are all linked to the Middle East issues, and some of them are unrelated to nuclear weapons completely. And so, I was with the executive secretary in Israel. I was with the executive secretary in Egypt, where we tried to convince the Egyptians to turn on this, to have the stations built, for Iran to keep their stations on, Iran to turn their stations on just to test them, and then they turn them off again. So Israel is not ratified, but Israel is actually doing a lot of good work in terms of making sure that the system is robust. But the question has always been to the Israelis, you've never tested, and nor do you plan to test. Why don't you ratify this treaty? But this is domestic politics. So in the case of the United States, the Senate will need to give 2/3 majority. 66 senators need to vote affirmatively to give their consent to ratification of this treaty. It failed in 1999, and it will not happen for, I would say, a very long time. Doesn't mean that they don't need to try and do it. And the final thing with North Korea, and I will go out on a limb here to say that of all the 8 states that still need to require, North Korea can actually sign this treaty and even ratify it, because the treaty does not ban the possession of nuclear weapons. So the point here is, does North Korea feel that it can sign this treaty? And if so, at what cost? But the big problem with this treaty is not singular one of these states. It is them all combined. The Executive Secretary Toth used to say that the treaty actually has an Asia-Pacific problem, because if you look at the countries that are required to sign and ratify, they're all from the Asia-Pacific region, including the United States, which is a Pacific state. And that is linked to the geopolitical problems in that region. And until you address those problems, this treaty will be a victim of it. But I want to end up on a more positive note, though, that for young diplomats such as yourself, and I know we have some students involved as well, this does not mean that you should not be almost an activist in support of this and other treaties, because without the CTBT, We don't have an FMCT, right? If the CTBT falls apart, there are almost no arms control treaties left between the United States and Russia. The only thing that will be out there is the NPT, and now the TPNW. But the TPNW only applies to those that have signed it. So the only thing is the NPT, and we know what the limitations are about the NPT. So, and then the other point about this is that this is actually the pinnacle of verification capabilities, although it's kind of getting long in the teeth now. I mean, some of the technologies are quite old, but this is a showcase that the international community can design a system that for decades we were told this is not possible. And so if this were to fall apart, then those countries with nuclear weapons win the race, because there's nothing out there that can keep them in place, even though the CTBT has its own limitations. Sorry, I went on the road long, but I wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. I will now ask Ambassador Marco or Jean if they have any final comments they wish to make.
Well, thank you very much. The first comment is to thank you very much for this possibility of addressing the summer course. It's for us a privilege. Thank you also for Jean Dupré for the very, very important and comprehensive presentation, and we learned also a lot from him. It's also very nice to see some of my ex-colleagues there in the screen, like Marta Mariana and Maria Fernanda, so greetings to them. And of course, we hope that this process of non-proliferation and disarmament is something that takes a long time, but we have to continue striving for it. This is extremely important, not only for you, but for your children and for our grandchildren. So we have to keep up on this quest and continue exploring all the ways to try to get rid of nuclear weapons out of the face of the earth.
And just quickly rebounding on Enrique's question that maybe wasn't fully answered. I don't think that the US sees the CTBT as customary international law that would apply to them. However, the CTBT is a lot of social and political pressure. And as Jean Dupré said, it's a lot of eyes on everything that all the nuclear weapon states or possible nuclear weapon states could be doing in terms of testing. So there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of value to that. My last comment would be that since as I said, I'm in the trenches, there's a lot of sausage making, and it is sometimes it's very concerning to note that there's diplomats like me deciding on the future of the CTBT and the preparatory commission. But I do think that we all have a shared objective, including nuclear weapon states, signatory states, including India, including Israel, the US, China, who have not ratified, who all have a stake in keeping this CTBT alive and the CTBTO working, even if it's not fully entered into force. And happy to see everyone from so many countries.
Thank you so much, Ambassador and Marco. I just wanted to make a quick comment. Jean mentioned that I'm very optimistic about the entry into force of the CTBT. Well, the secret of this optimism is the fact that I'm part of the CTBTO youth group. And yeah, I see a lot of in the activities that CTBTO and CTBTO youth group organize. I see a lot of young people, young diplomats, and young activists who just direct their career to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Every day promote the treaty, the importance of the treaty and its verification regime. So I will put in the chat the link to the group. And since we have a lot of young diplomats and also students here in this session, I would encourage you to consider joining the group, because yeah, it provides you a lot of opportunities, and yeah, it's just an incredible community. I will wrap up, and I will pass the floor to Jean now. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, and let me also thank the Ambassador and Marco for their excellent presentation. It was good to get a up-to-date Vienna perspective, especially from an important country such as Mexico. I did not refer to the youth group. I actually took 2 slides out. I was there when this was established, and I do encourage those of you who are not yet part of the youth group, especially and also our students, because I know several of them are, to do that. As the ambassador also pointed out, the treaty is, you have to look at the future to maintain this treaty. And those of us with more gray in the hair that we care for, we're going to rely on the younger generation to take it over.